What is going on, everybody? Welcome on into the FanDuel Waiver Wire Facebook Live Q&A, getting you set to put in those waiver claims for the fantasy football playoffs in week number 14. My name is Jim Sannes. I am a senior writer and analyst for NumberFire.com, joined here as always by JJ Zachariason. He is the editor-in-chief of FanDuel and NumberFire. JJ, happy fantasy football playoffs to you. How you doing today?
I'm good. I had some luck in my favor this past week to get some teams in there, so I'm feeling good about things heading into the playoffs.
And it's always a good feeling if you can feel good the Tuesday of the fantasy playoffs. So congrats to all of you who are still alive and kicking out there. Congrats to anyone who may have buys out there. But as always, still some tinkering we can make to those rosters. If you have questions for us here on this Facebook Live Q&A, make sure you hit us up in the comment section on Facebook. You can put any questions you've got right there. We'll try to get to as many as we can to set your waiver wire priorities for tonight. If you're on Twitter, we can go there too. And if you are on YouTube and watching on the FanDuel YouTube page, we can also try to get in some questions from there as well. But JJ, a couple of big news items from this weekend. The first one was the Kansas City Chiefs running back situation with Darrell Williams seeming unlikely to play this weekend, and Damian Williams still unsure with that rib injury, leaving basically LaShawn McCoy and potentially Darwin Thompson in that backfield. And then last night, Dalvin Cook banging up his shoulder. Now, he says he's going to play in week 14, but the good thing about Cook is that we know who his immediate backup is, and that's Alexander Mattison. So if you're looking at your waiver wire and you've got both Darwin Thompson and Alexander Mattison out there, who are you prioritizing as of right now?
Yeah, look, I'm shooting for upside, right? And I think the upside play is to go with Alexander Mattison, not because I think that he's necessarily going to be projected to score as many fantasy points as Darwin Thompson as early as this week, potentially, given the fact that we don't know what's going on with Dalvin Cook. But if something were bad with Dalvin Cook and if he does miss time, Alexander Madison's an RB1 in fantasy football, just given the situation he's in and given the fact that he's probably going to see a huge workload in that offense. So to me, Madison would be the guy because Darwin Thompson, he's a smaller frame guy, but he is beefy from a muscle standpoint. He can squat a lot. But Darwin Thompson's someone who's probably not going to be featured in that backfield. And really, if you look at how Kansas City has run their running backs this season, they've only had 4 games where the running back has seen a running back rush share north of 60%. And 3 of those games were done by Damian Williams, the other one by LaShawn McCoy. So, I don't think that Darwin Thompson, or really even McCoy to a degree, is going to see a massive workload because they're still going to split up that backfield. So I'm not as high on Thompson. I think he's a great add this week because there's not that much else, and we know the Kansas City offense is good. But at the same time, I think Madison's the guy who's going to provide a little bit more upside.
And I think the key thing to keep in mind with Darwin Thompson is that, yes, he did well in week 13, but all of that was after the Chiefs were already up 31-3 and Darrell Williams is out. If Damian Williams comes back, I don't know if Darwin Thompson will have a role in that offense at all, and that's something to keep in mind for sure. There is a possibility that he gets you nothing, whereas Alexander Mattison, I think, even if Dalvin Cook is healthy, he has shown this year he can still be a semi-viable play, especially as a big home favorite. That's the situation which the Vikings have used Mattison most this year when they get up big. So I think that I'd agree. Mattison is pretty clearly ahead of Darwin Thompson, and that Chiefs running back situation is very fluid, to say the least. And there are a lot of guys. Madison's trying to beat out one dude. Darwin Thompson, depending on the health, the other guys could be trying to beat out 3 other guys, and that's important. So I would agree that Mattison is the number 1 priority on waivers this week. Let's get some questions here from Facebook Live. Joe Pro K is asking, I need a quarterback. Patrick Mahomes, Ryan Fitzpatrick, Ryan Tannehill, Josh Allen. He needs to get in the playoffs. So it sounds like playoffs do not start until week 15 here for Joe. Patrick Mahomes, we know how good he is, but go on the road to Foxborough to face the Patriots. How are you handling that situation between those options?
I'd probably still go with Mahomes, especially after what we saw with Deshaun Watson this past week and the Patriots defense looking human to a degree. I would probably still lean Mahomes because I think he has the highest floor. I think he's the safest option there. And then obviously, he has a ceiling because it's Patrick Mahomes. Outside of that, the one name that I heard that's kind of intriguing, two names actually, but one of them is safer. I would say Ryan Tannehill's safer. Gets Oakland this week, Houston next week. So 2+ matchups for Tannehill. But Ryan Fitzpatrick has some really juicy matchups. I think he gets both New York teams and the Bengals over the next 3 weeks. So he has a really favorable schedule. So he's sort of a deeper play that no one's really going to be spending any fob on or using a high waiver priority on. So if you can't get Tannehill, or if he's, if Tannehill's already rostered, that's great. But if you're looking to get Tannehill and you can't get him, I think Ryan Fitzpatrick's the other guy that you could look to.
Yeah, Ryan Fitzpatrick may be getting the Jets without Jamal Adams because he did turn his ankle on Sunday. And if the Jets are already a plus matchup, but if you take their best player out of the equation, they become one of the best matchups in football. So Fitzpatrick makes sense. I agree, though. Mahomes is still startable. The Patriots have had only 4 games this year in which they have faced a team ranked in the top half of the league in schedule-adjusted passing offense based on number fires metrics. This has been the Browns, who are 15th, which is weird given the perception of the Browns, the Baltimore Ravens, the Houston Texans, and the Dallas Cowboys. And that Dallas game was really bad weather. So we haven't really seen them against good offenses. They are a good defense. Even when you adjust for schedule, they're still a very good defense. But I think that Mahomes and company are a team that can still do pretty well against them. So I would still use Mahomes there as well. Ian Soltero is asking, any other beefy running backs we should be adding? I did see a picture. I forgot who tweeted it, but it was of Darwin Thompson, and he is kind of jacked.
Yeah, he's jacked. You guys are making fun of the beefy comment, but the man is big for a 5'8" dude.
He's like DK Metcalf if DK Metcalf were like 5'5". Basically.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Raheem Mostert, if he's out there, I think that he's viable to add off the waiver wire. All jokes aside. He's probably the only other running back I think that I featured in the 15 transactions column this week, only because Mostert surprisingly took over the San Francisco backfield this week. The running lanes for him were really big. I don't think Raheem Mostert is someone that's a game-changing running back that absolutely needs to be on the field. But you can't ignore the fact that he saw like 79% of the team's running back rushes this week. So to me, Mostert, if he's out there, I think you at least have to add him. You probably just can't start him, not just because we don't know how things are going to be divvied up, but they also get New Orleans. And that's a tough matchup.
Yeah, and the good thing about the 49ers is they've used a committee all year. So even with Matt Breida likely being back, he's still probably going to get some work. And at this point in the year, some work will work in season-long fantasy. James Ferguson asks, is Patrick Laird worth a shot versus the Indianapolis running back committee? So this is dependent on Marlon Mack potentially being back this week. We don't really know. It sounded like they were riding Jordan Wilkins because of the hot hand in Indy. Would you go with Patrick Laird over Jonathan Williams, Jordan Wilkins this week if Marlon Mack can't come back?
If you're choosing out of any Indianapolis running back, I think Nyheim Hines is still a little bit intriguing because Tampa Bay, you can't really run the ball on them. I could see them, dropping back to pass a good bit, which would then benefit Nyheim Hines. I have a tough time using any Miami running back, let alone against a defense that's actually stopped the run pretty well, despite their moves on the defensive line. So I think I would probably lean a Colts running back, probably Nyheim Hines as the floor play. But I'm trying to avoid both backfields, I would say.
Yeah, that's probably the go-to move. Patrick Laird did play a lot of snaps on Sunday, but he also had 10 carries for 5 yards. He's a pass-catching back, so he's going to get some work there for sure, and that does matter. But it's a lot less valuable behind that Dolphins offensive line than it is behind the Colts offensive line. We know that Hines is probably going to have at least some role there for sure. A couple of questions here from Rick Shamrow. It could be Shamrow, but I want to think about ShamWow instead. Yes, so we're going to go Shamrow. Duke or Darwin? So Duke Johnson or Darwin Thompson? Duke Johnson actually played a lot of snaps on Sunday, and it seemed to be game plan specific, but it seems like there's a pretty steady role there. Would you trust him or Darwin more if you're looking for a running back off the wire?
It's actually tough. I think Duke is probably safer. Realistically, Duke Johnson's role is probably what we would hope for Darwin Thompson in a scenario where both Williams players are out. So I think logically Duke makes sense and he's safer. Darwin maybe has more upside because there is some ambiguity, but I would probably lean Duke there.
All right. The second question from Rick Shamrow is Curtis Samuel or Darius Slayton? And this one, we're deciding now because we have to pick guys up, but the Slayton situation specifically is tough because we don't know Golden Tate and Evan Ingram's outlook. And I think that Slayton is most viable in that Giants offense when both those guys are out. But if you're deciding between picking up Curtis Samuel or Darius Slayton, which one would you favor?
Yeah, I think you nailed it with the injuries with the Giants right now because Darius Slayton's probably not going to be very super relevant, let's say. Because remember, back when Golden Tate was healthy, and Darius Slayton was playing with Golden Tate and producing, Sterling Shepard wasn't playing. Now Sterling Shepard's back, and he's back into good form. So that means when Golden Tate comes back, Slayton will be out there on 3 wide sets, but 2 wide sets, we're not going to see Slayton. He's just not going to see as much volume if Golden Tate's healthy. And then if Evan Ingram's healthy, then that's even less volume for Slayton. I think Curtis Samuel is probably safer, but we've seen, week in and week out that Curtis Samuel's essentially become a pretty touchdown dependent wide receiver, which is odd because he's someone who sees a lot of air yards and he can get big chunks of yards. But he's really been touchdown dependent this year. I'd probably lean Samuel. I think he's a little bit safer just given the injury ambiguity there. But I think you can make a case at least for Darius Slayton.
Yeah, if we were to get word that both Tate and Ingram weren't going to go this week, then I think that Slayton would have a better case then. But as of right now, we don't know that. So if you're playing for the safety angle, I think that Samuel does make more sense. James Burkhalter asks, thoughts on playing Chubb and Kareem Hunt together, and then Carson and Rashad Penny in the same lineup. Both these teams are using their running backs aggressively from a usage perspective. So let's say you've got both, starting off with the Browns guys. Would you be okay using Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt in the same lineup?
Yeah, I mean, it obviously depends on my alternatives, but this week they're big favorites against Cincinnati. I could see both of them being utilized a good bit. I was actually looking before we started the show. Kareem Hunt, definitely, he has some standalone value. He's been sort of like a flex play since he's come back. But he's definitely dug into Nick Chubb's workload. Nick Chubb has seen his running back rush share drop from 91% to about 77%. His target share dropped from 12% to 8%. His fantasy points per game has dropped by about 4 points. So Nick Chubb has not been the same Nick Chubb with Kareem Hunt in that backfield. With that being said, I think it's viable this week specifically against a team like Cincinnati. And Cleveland does have a couple of easy matchups over their next couple of weeks. So I think it's viable to a degree. It just depends on your alternative. And I think that you can make the same exact argument for Seattle as well. Yeah. This week they're in a matchup against the Rams that's not necessarily unbelievable to have both running backs in there. I don't think we're going to see a scenario where both of them necessarily find the end zone like we saw last night. But again, you have a banged up Tyler Lockett. They're leaning on the run game a little bit more. Teams are really forcing the Seahawks to run the ball, which makes sense. They should be doing that. So I think both Penny and Carson are still viable. I still view Carson as an RB2, Penny as maybe a high-end 3 to a flex play. But yeah, I mean, it always depends on the alternative in scenarios like this.
Absolutely. Brad Singer wants to know, Robbie Anderson has a favorable playoff schedule. Is he worth a pickup? Robbie Anderson coming off, I believe, a 10-target day, and now gets the Dolphins. I don't think he's just worth a pickup. I think he's worth like a pretty high-quality start this week. What do you think about Robbie Anderson?
Yeah, it's weird. If you look at the last 5 weeks, Jamison Crowder, the first 3 weeks of those 5 was awesome. He was basically a wide receiver 1 throughout those 3 weeks. Last 2 weeks, things have shifted over to Robbie Anderson. So it could be a scenario where we see Jamison Crowder feast against this Miami defense if the matchup presents itself. But yeah, Robbie Anderson's in a good spot because you can beat this Miami secondary in a lot of different ways. So I do think Robbie Anderson's worth a start this week, maybe a wide receiver 3 type play just because all teams are playing now. There aren't any bye weeks. There's a lot of good wide receivers out there, but he's definitely in play in this type of matchup.
And my personal preference for guys like Anderson who get work down the field is to use those guys when they're at home, and Robbie Anderson is at home in week number 14 against the Dolphins, so I think that is a boost to him as well. Bethany Peters asks, Alshon or Geis or Benny Snell Jr. the fourth Esquire? Alshon Jeffrey coming off a pretty big day. Darius Geis didn't get a ton of work, but he's been awesome in the work he has gotten. What's your ranking of those 3 guys going forward? Alshon Jeffrey, Darius Geis, and Benny Snell.
Yeah, I mean, if it's a PPR league, I think you can make the case for Alshon. The reason I'm not as sold on Darius Geis is he still played the 3rd most snaps on his own team this past week, behind both Chris Thompson and Adrian Peterson. And if you take a step back and you look at Washington, you have to ask yourself, why would they be running Darius Geis into the ground in a lost season? It doesn't make a ton of sense for them to really change things up. They were also effective last week against Carolina, so why would they change things up? So I'm a little bit worried about Geis because it's not like he's going to be able to do that week in and week out, but he's by far the most talented running back on that team, and it's not even close, so don't take that the wrong way. Right. Benny Snell starting to see more work. I think he's viable as a flex if James Conner misses time. We don't know for sure. I saw a report today, though, with James Conner that he's going to sort of feel out what's going on with his shoulder until he knows for sure he doesn't need surgery. Which means if there are issues where he might need surgery, it sounds to me like it's either they're big issues, something big is going on with his shoulder, or he should probably just get surgery and just get it done. And I mean, it's not a great situation for James Conner. So James Conner misses time. There's a decent matchup against Arizona this week where Pittsburgh could see a positive script realistically. I think they're favorites in that game. So Benny Snell's not a bad option, but just given the way that Philly is sort of built and Alshon's target shares when he's been healthy this year, he's been usable when he's been healthy. I think he's the guy that I would want if it's a PPR format.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I was under the assumption that James Conner was going to be back this week, given they did practice last week, but that doesn't sound so hot. So I definitely think that is worth keeping an eye on throughout this week because that would change Benny Snell's appeal quite a bit. Mark Swingle is asking, is it worth grabbing Ryan Fitzpatrick and playing him over Tom Brady or Matt Ryan? First round of playoffs this week. Now, we talked about Ryan Fitzpatrick's matchup if Jamal Adams can't go, but Tom Brady is at home against the Chiefs. And we've seen Brady struggle, but that's a really fun game. What do you think about Ryan relative to someone like Brady relative to Fitzpatrick, and then Matt Ryan in there, he is at home against Carolina as well.
Yeah, so I what you're looking at with Matt Ryan and Tom Brady are two fairly inconsistent assets right now. Brady got a little bit of garbage time this past week against Houston, but I still watch, looking at that game and looking back at the way Brady performed, it makes sense that you have this dilemma, despite the fact that Kansas City, from a game standpoint and game flow standpoint and how this game could be higher scoring potentially. I still am a little bit worried about Tom Brady. And Kansas City, realistically, their strength on defense is in the secondary. It's not in the run game. So I could see New England, a team that always knows how to exploit opposing defenses, going with a pretty ground and pound approach. Which means it could be more of a Sony Michel, James White type of day. Ryan Fitzpatrick, I think, has a pretty high floor this week. He's shown that he has a high floor week in and week out. Matt Ryan, not a bad play, but it's not necessarily a great matchup. I can make an argument for any of those guys. I might lean Brady if you think that that game's going to be higher scoring. But I do think that the safest floor at this point, especially if Julio doesn't play, is probably Ryan Fitzpatrick, as crazy as that sounds.
Yeah, and the one thing to keep in mind with Matt Ryan, too, is they're facing the Cardinals for the second time in just a couple of weeks, and that's generally a pretty big red flag. Like we saw that Falcons-Saints game go pretty easily under the total on Thursday on Thanksgiving. I don't think that was, I think that the divisional matchup rematch just a couple weeks later likely played a slight role in there. So that does, at least for me, downgrade Matt Ryan. Bethany Peters asks Jack Doyle or Dallas Goedert to pick up and stream at tight end for this week. Jack Doyle had a really good role last week with no Eric Ebron there for Indy, and he's facing the Buccaneers. Dallas Goedert is facing the Giants on Monday night. So two really good spots for, stream-worthy tight ends. Who would you favor between the two?
I think I'd go with Jack Doyle. The volume that he's seen, there's no Eric Ebron. It's a decent matchup just from a passing standpoint for Indianapolis. And there's some worry about Dallas Goedert. This past week with healthy wide receivers for Philadelphia, Dallas Goedert only ran 21 routes. Zach Ertz ran 38, and that was a banged up Zach Ertz. Dallas Goedert being fed a lot when he was on the field is a good sign because Dallas Goedert's good, and for some reason they don't let him run routes more often. But his snap rate was lower than what we've seen over the last few weeks. So I think that there's some hesitation there for Dallas Goedert. I like the matchup. I think that he should be fine. But I would just go with the safer option of the two as a result and just go with Jack Doyle.
Yeah, and even if T.Y. Hilton does come back, removing Eric Ebron from the equation means that Doyle's not going to go back to the workload he had before last week. It'll be somewhere between where he was last week and before, but that's good enough to be a viable tight end play, especially against a team that encourages you to pass against them. Nick Lacreta asks, should I add Madison? We talked about that at the top. We agree that Alexander Madison is the top ad for this week, so absolutely there, Nick. Alec Wettenhall asks, Jonathan Harrison is on the waiver wire, but I'm terrified to touch any Colts running back. Jonathan Harrison is the Jets center, so I would not pick him up, but assuming it's Jonathan Williams. Would you add a Jonathan Williams if he is available, or was last week grim enough where you want no part of it?
Yeah, so I mean, look, Harrison Williams, they're like the same name, so it makes sense.
I had no idea what Albert Wilson's name was 2 weeks ago. So I get it, Alec. We're in the same boat, man. You're good.
No, so with Jonathan Williams, I mean, the way that you have to think about, because, again, we have only 3 more weeks of the fantasy season. which means, you can't just wait and wait and wait for certain things to kind of come to fruition. So really the way that you have to approach things is how predictable is this performance actually going to be? So if Jonathan Williams has a big game, that could happen. Sure. We've seen Jonathan Williams have big games, but at the same time, Marlon Mack is likely to come back at some point, maybe even this week. And then is that big performance from Jonathan Williams, even if Marlon Mack is sidelined, going to be predictable? Because this week, I don't think you can sit back and say, I'm going to play Jonathan Williams after we saw Jordan Wilkins see the work that he saw in that backfield this past week. So to me, you can leave Jonathan Williams on the waiver wire. Don't worry about it. And the same goes with guys like, someone in my 15 transactions column today who was a drop candidate is Sammy Watkins. He hasn't performed over the last couple of weeks, only has a 10% target share. Can Sammy Watkins have a big game down the stretch? Yes. Is it going to be predictable? Probably not. And it's not like you have 5 or 6 weeks to wait for Sammy Watkins to give you that steady production to feel good about playing him. So just drop Sammy Watkins. Just let him go to the waiver wire, let him be someone else's problem, and just go from there.
Yeah, with Jonathan Williams, you're not starting in week 14, and in week 15, Marlon Mack's probably going to be back. So there's really no situation, I wouldn't think, in which Jonathan Williams would be a guy you would start with confidence going forward. Corey Sherman asks, who should I use my number one priority on? Zach Pascal or Jacob Hollister? He says his current tight end is TJ Hawkinson, who's going to injured reserve, which should influence things here. But would you prioritize Pascal or Hollister, assuming you need a tight end?
Yeah, if I need a tight end, I'd probably just go with Hollister. I mean, over the last 3 weeks, he's seen a 24.5% target share in that Seattle offense. And it's an offense that something's going on with Tyler Lockett. I mean, I know that he had that thigh injury or whatever it was, where he was like hospitalized and things weren't looking great. But something's going on with Tyler Lockett to the point where, I mean, he's barely been involved the last 3 weeks. I mean, that's also coincided with Jacob Hollister emerging as the single tight end threat in that offense, and they play in the similar area of the field. So it could be partially Hollister, it could be partially the injury, but regardless, Hollister is seeing enough volume to warrant being added and being an every week starter. And then on top of that, week 15, I want to say, Seattle gets Arizona, maybe week 16, but one of those weeks. And we know that Arizona is by far the friendliest team against tight ends.
That will work for sure. What about Zach Pascal just broadly, not relative to Hollister, but Pascal basically whenever T.Y. Hilton hasn't gone has had really good workloads, and they're facing Tampa Bay this week. If Pascal's available, is he someone you would be comfortable adding and starting in week 14?
Yeah, I mean, I think Pascal's probably a wide receiver 3 if T.Y. Hilton doesn't play this week. He's seen a 22% target share without Hilton in the lineup this year. That's 5 games worth, so it's a decent-sized sample. Hasn't been amazing from a production standpoint, but we've seen him with spiked games. And against Tampa Bay is by far the worst team against wide receivers this year when you adjust for strength of opponent. I think Pascal is definitely in play. Yeah,
absolutely. And he's really solid. And he's had yardage upside, too, which is encouraging, both from a floor perspective and a ceiling perspective. Nick Lacreta asks, how should we think about the Seahawks backfield now, especially if you own both Carson and Penny? We talked about that before, where JJ's viewing Carson as an RB2, and Penny is a guy you can definitely use as a flex option. The volume should be good enough for Penny to justify that for sure. Rick Shamrow is asking, need a tight end. Got Vance McDonald against those Cardinals, Tyler Higbee, Jason Witten, pick one. McDonald hasn't really done anything all year, but does get the Cardinals. How are you viewing McDonald, Higbee, and Witten for week number 14?
I never get excited with Jason Witten, so we can just throw that aside. I mean, he might find the end zone, but it's just very tough to trust him. So it comes down to McDonald or Higbee. Higbee obviously has this monster game this past week. I wouldn't say it's a bad matchup against Seattle. We saw what Kyle Rudolph did against them last night. I don't mind him as long as Everett's still out. I think he's still out. But regardless, I think I would just go with the matchup and just hope that this matchup continues to be fruitful. Go with Vance McDonald because Arizona has been really, really dreadfully awful against tight ends this year.
And the production hasn't been there for Vance McDonald, but the targets have been. Pulling up his target numbers here recently. He had 7 targets in 3 straight games. He's been at 1 and 3 the past 2, but that's largely because they've been very run heavy. So I think that he's at least on the table, I would say, at tight end. James Ferguson wants to know Ryan Griffin or Mike Gesicki at tight end in PPR. Gesicki, since Preston Williams' injury, has 17% of the Dolphins' targets. He's been very inconsistent, but that's true for all tight ends. Whereas Ryan Griffin, on the other side of that game, at home against Miami, between those two on the waiver wires this week, which one would you prefer to pick up?
Yeah, and Gesicki in his last 2 games, an 18.4% target share in each of those games. He just continues to see a double-digit target share week in and week out. And like you mentioned, that's basically been since Preston Williams has been out of the lineup. I think Gesicki's the play. I think that he's a strong option from here on out, just given the fact that Ryan Fitzpatrick has a lot of DGAF to him and will just throw the ball up. We know Devontae Parker's been balling out too, but there's really no number 2 option in that offense, and that allows Mike Gesicki to kind of be that guy.
And again, if Jamal Adams can't go, it's going to further decrease the ability of the Jets defense to cover anybody, but especially the middle of the field should be wide open there for Gesicki. John Lormus wants to know, should I be worried about Tyler Lockett for my playoff run? You were just talking about his lack of involvement, and people are probably in the playoffs with Tyler Lockett on their roster. What's your level of confidence in using him? You know, are you trying to avoid starting him if you can, or are you going back to Lockett against the Rams?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting dilemma because the Rams have actually not been very good against slot wide receivers this year, despite the talent that they have at corner in the slot, and even obviously with Jalen Ramsey now too. I actually don't think that, all things considered, that he's that bad of a play this week because of the matchup. But like I said, I think something's going wrong with Tyler Lockett. Like, this guy is a very talented wide receiver who over the course of the season has been fed, but it's since that injury, he hasn't really been involved as much. So it's tough to trust him. I think it just depends on who your alternatives are. I think I would probably still view him more as a wide receiver 3 rather than the wide receiver 2 that he really is.
Yeah, there's a lot of risk there, but there's still the potential for it to be much better. So I think that's kind of how you view it. It's a risk reward situation. And if you're comparing him to other guys with a lot of risk, then it might make sense to go with Lockett and roll with the upside if he does regain his previous role. Chris Raponzica is asking, could I drop Cooper Kupp with the playoff schedule after week 14? The Rams have the Seahawks this week. They have the Cowboys on the road next week, and then the 49ers in week 16. And I guess my general philosophy is I can't worry about week 16 until I get to week 16. Yeah. And so it's hard for me to look that far ahead personally. What are you doing with Cooper Kupp, given it's just kind of an okay schedule going forward for the Rams?
I mean, look, so Jared Goff and the Jared Goff splits against top defenses have not been good, but against average to below average ones, they've been really good. And if you look at Seattle, when you adjust for strength of opponent, they're slightly below average. I think it's a little bit worrisome because it's in the division, but they really haven't generated that much quarterback pressure this year either. So I don't think the matchup is that bad. Then on top of that, Cooper Kupp has still been fine for the most part. The whole entire Rams offense was bad in the month of November because it starts with how well the passing attack in general is going to perform. But Cooper Kupp, he's had some down games, but he came through this past week against Arizona. He was fine. I know Robert Woods had a bigger day, but Cooper Kupp was still fine. I think he's going to be a top 20 wide receiver, probably rankings wise, over the next 2 weeks, maybe a top 25 to 30 guy against San Francisco, because they actually can defend the slot pretty well too. So again, like Jim said, I would play Cooper Kupp the next 2 weeks. If I get to the championship, then I'll be worried and ask that question and figure out what I'm going to do.
And I agree with your thoughts on week 14 because the Seahawks actually have the 3rd lowest sack rate on defense in football, which is kind of wild. Think about, and Jaron Reed is banged up again, which is not going to help that number. So I think I would agree that the matchup is better than it would seem, especially with the Rams being at home. They also have the 2nd best sack rate in football on the offensive side. So I think this could be a game where Jared Goff can remain upright, and that's generally a good thing for the Rams offense. Nick Lacreta is asking, if Evan Engram suits up this week, are you playing him, especially if your other options are no bueno? And generally tight end, that's probably going to be the case. But Evan Engram coming off a multi-week absence, it is an injury to his lower body, which is not good either for a multi-week absence. So if Evan Engram plays, are you playing him?
I mean, if we don't hear reports that there's going to be limited snaps for Ingram, I think that you can roll him from a season-long perspective. Obviously, DFS is different because you need that upside, and that ruins his upside to a degree. But if you don't have other alternatives, I think it's fine to play Ingram. I just, you got to hope that we get some reports throughout the week if he's going to be limited or if he's not going to play, obviously. So that's kind of the way that I would approach something like that.
And I think the big issue with Engram is that they're playing Monday night. So you're not going to know when the Sunday game starts for sure if he'll play. He could be questionable at that time. So you kind of have to have a backup option on your bench waiting in case you just don't know on Sunday, you could have Caden Smith potentially available, as a guy you could use if Ingram can't go, because Smith's role has been awesome the past couple of weeks, and he showed some downfield bursts too. So it could be that Caden Smith is your backup option. But overall, I think that it's just good to be aware of the fact they do play a Monday night for that one. That is all the time that we have for today on this Waiver Wire Q&A. JJ, what is your schedule over on the Late Round Podcast for the rest of this week?
Yeah, 15 transaction show dropped today. I'll have a 10 trend show tomorrow, a matchup show the next day, and then the mailbag show on Friday. Definitely check it out. Anywhere podcasts can be found, the Late Round Podcast.
And you can follow JJ on Twitter at Late Round QB. We also have our DFS podcast still going up every Monday and Thursday. Monday is a recap podcast. Week 13 recap with Brandon Gadula already posted. And then our Week 14 preview goes up on Thursday. Subscribe to the Number Fire Daily Fantasy Podcast feed to get all of those. I am on Twitter at Jim Sannes as well, JimSannes, if you have any further questions. Big thank you to Calvin Theobald for running the video side of things here today. Thank you as always, Cal, and thank you to everyone for tuning in for this FanDuel Waiver Wire Facebook Live Q&A. JJ is back with you on Sunday to answer your start-sit questions for the first round of the playoffs. We'll be back with you next week. Hopefully, you're still alive and can tune in then. We'll talk to you next week. This has been the FanDuel Facebook Live Waiver Wire Q&A.